Okay, so I want to finish up just talking a bit more about enthymemes and just some features of formal logic that are important. And so let me take a little argument that um, Van Cleve threw out earlier, and it's Violet is a dog, so Violet is a mammal. Now, is this valid, right? Van Cleve gave this as an example of a valid argument, right? And given common knowledge, given what we all know, we can see that it is. Dogs are mammals. That's just what a dog is. Any definition of a dog that doesn't say that dogs are mammals is just not right, right? It's not a mammal, it's not a dog. But we have now gotten a more precise definition of validity. Validity is all about form, right? It's about the form of an argument, not about what the argument's talking about. And to see that this argument's valid, you would have to know what dogs are, you would have to know what mammals are. For an argument to be valid, you shouldn't have to know that stuff. All you should have to do is look at the form of the argument and see, if the form is right. If you drew a Venn diagram from what the argument said, or you used these rules of inference, would the conclusion necessarily follow from those rules? If not, the argument is not valid. And so this one is not valid, right? Let's think about the form of this argument. X is an A, so X is a B, right? Violet is our X. She's our singular thing. We replace that with an X. Category is dogs. We replace that with an A. So X is a B, right? When we don't have the words there, when we don't know the meanings, suddenly, well, this is no longer valid. We don't know, right? So to make this valid, we would have to fill in a premise in such a way that now when we draw our Venn diagram, X has to fall in the B circle, right? From what we have here, all we know, if we draw our Venn diagram, we'd have an A and a B. We could put the X anywhere in the A. We wouldn't have to put it in the B, right? We need to know that all A or B, that, we black out everything in our A circle that's not in the B circle. Once we do that, any X we put down is going to have to be in the A circle. Now the argument is valid. So two things here that I want you to notice about validity. One, as we've already said, everything is about form, right? We have now reached the point, I said earlier on, logic is about form. We are just looking at form. We are not thinking about what the words are about. Two, everything must be spelled out. When we are in the level of formal logic, you cannot rely on what people might know. If there's an enthymeme there, this common knowledge that all dogs are mammals, you need to spell it out. Nothing can go unstated. With formal logic, you have to be very slow, very explicit, very literal. Now, having said that, if I gave you this argument, my point here is just this is an enthymeme, even though we all know it's valid. We know it's valid because of something we know about dogs. To make the argument valid at the level of formal logic, we would need to spell out this thing we all know about dogs, right? So two more things I want to talk about, right? Now remember, when we first talked about arguments with missing premises, it was hard because we're like, okay, how do we fill these missing premises in, right? Took a lot of judgment. In formal logic, in formal deductive logic, it is not so hard to fill missing premises in. It's not so hard to fill enthymemes in. Now, there's some things we have to rule out, though. Because if I just tell you, well, we add a premise that makes the argument valid, there are actually some tricky easy but kind of dirty ways to do this, and I don't want you to do that. Unless, of course, I give you an extra credit question on the exam, which this should be a hint to you guys that I will give you an extra credit question on the exam like this. This says, what are two quick, easy, dirty ways to make an argument valid? So I want to talk about these because A, in real life, you don't want to do these. B, it's good to know these for purposes of the test. So look at this. Violet is a dog. Violet is a mammal. So Violet is a mammal. Is this a valid argument? Well, actually, it is, right? Remember, we said if the premises can't be true, if the premises are all true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Well, our second premise is that Violet is a mammal. So if that premise is true, then the conclusion, which just restates the premise with a so tacked on, has to be true as well. This is not a good argument. It begs the question when you restate your conclusion as one of your premises. That's a question-begging argument. That is not a good thing to do. Why? Well, we're trying to convince somebody of something or give reasons for something. Just restating our conclusion doesn't do that. But technically speaking, this is valid. If all the premises are true, conclusion has to be true as well. Well, it's valid. Not a good argument, but remember, validity is not about good, whole stop. Validity is just about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Here's a more surprising one. Violet is a dog. Violet is not a dog, so Violet is a mammal. Is this valid? Well, it actually is, very surprisingly, right? Now you might think this is a terrible, nonsensical argument. We have a contradiction. We're saying that she's both a dog and not a dog. Well, but think about our definition of validity. For validity, well, if the premises are all true, the conclusion has to be true as well. And so one way of thinking about this is to think about every single case where the premises are all true and to check to see if the conclusion is true as well in those cases. Well, remember, logic is very literal, so lo and behold, if there are no cases where all the premises are true, which if they contradict each other, there aren't, well, in every case where the premises are all true, the conclusion's true as well, because there are no cases where the premises are all true. To show an argument is invalid, there has to be one case where the premises are all true and the conclusion's false. By our very technical definition of validity, that is not true. That is true here, right? There's no case where the premises are all true and the conclusion false. For the very technical reason, there is no case, no possible case where the premises are all true. So, quick and dirty ways of making an argument valid. Add the conclusion as a premise. Add a premise that contradicts a premise that's already there. In both of those cases, technically, the argument will be valid. Now look, let's just say when we fill in enthymemes, there are rules to prevent this, right? Especially in syllogistic logic. So when I ask you to fill in an enthymeme, the premise filled in cannot restate the conclusion. You can't just tack in the conclusion as a premise unless I ask you to do that. That's a rule. We don't do that. That's not a formal mistake. An argument that does that is valid, but it's a bad argument. It does what we call begging the question. You don't want to do that, so don't do that when you fill in enthymemes. You cannot fill in a premise that contradicts a premise that's already there. Why? We do that. our argument, we want an argument to be valid at the very least, but if possible, we want it to be sound. An argument with contradictory premises cannot be sound, right? When one premise is true, the other one is false. Or you can even imagine a self-contradictory premise. We could say Violet is a dog and Violet is not a dog. We can make that one premise, add that to any argument, that argument's valid. Voila, right? It would never be sound because that premise can't be true, but it would be valid. Because it can't be sound, it's not a good argument. We don't want to fill it in that way if we can help it. Now, whatever you fill in, however you fill the argument in, it should fit the syllogistic form, this 1, 2, 3. Possibly 1, 2, 3, and then 3 is a premise and a new argument. 4, 5, 4, 5. Maybe 5's, we're not going to have any of this complex, but 5 could be a new premise itself, 5, 6, 7. It should fit this syllogistic 1, 2, 3 with arguments possibly chained together form. If we follow these rules, remember we had a lot of trouble. It's a lot more art than science filling in a missing premise at the level of informal logic. At the level of formal deductive logic, it should be a lot clearer what premise we need to fill in. Let me end with one argument, though. It will snow tonight, so TCC will cancel classes tomorrow. So how should we fill this in, right? The most natural way would be just to add this conditional, right? If A, then B, if A, then B, A, so B. If we have it will snow, so TCC will cancel class, if we fill in if it snows, TCC will cancel class, we now have a valid argument. If A, then B, A, so B. But what about this? We can also fill in as our first premise either it will not snow or TCC will cancel class. It will snow, so TCC will cancel class. Either not A or B, either A is false or B is true. A is true, so B is true. If we do this, we are just using this, disjunctive syllogism, argument by elimination, you might hear it called. This would also make the argument valid. So which is right? If A, then B, or either not A or B? It actually doesn't matter. And I'm not going to get deeply into this, but it actually turns out that either not A or B, or if A and B are logically equivalent. These statements, whenever one is true, the other one will be true. Whenever one is false, the other one will be false. Remember, we've already talked about logical equivalence. No A or B is logically equivalent to, no B or A is logically equivalent to no A or B. Some A or B is logically equivalent to some B or A. Not the case with all or some or not statements. With those, order matters, but remember, with no and some are statements, order doesn't matter. They're logically equivalent no matter what order you put it in. This is a little more complicated. If we had a little more time in class, I would talk more about this, but doesn't matter here because these statements are logically equivalent. For purposes of logic, they mean the same thing. Now look, for the time being, we don't have to get too deeply into that. All I care when I give you an enthymeme on the test or on an assignment is I want you to make it valid. If you fill in a premise that makes it valid, fine, good, we're done. That's all you need to do. Just know that because some statements are logically equivalent, there sometimes might be more than one way of doing this. But, this is a lot more precise. We do have a lot clearer idea of what we need to fill in than we do with informal logic. All right, so that's really all I want to say about enthymemes. There's a lot going on here, but hopefully this covers the basic idea.